You're listening to What is Black Podcast, a podcast where we have frank discussions about being Black in America to help parents guide their children through the positive and negative narratives. I'm your host, Dr. Jacqueline Duget. Today we have another great episode, so let's start the show. So I am so pleased to have as our special guest today, Dani McClain. She's a journalist and the author of a new book that just came out in April, We Live for the We, the Political Power of Black Motherhood. Welcome, Dani.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I first learned about the book, Dani, via Twitter, and I think that's where I'm learning about a lot of great authors and topics that are sort of focused on the podcast. And I also, listened to a recent podcast that you went on, The Longest Shortest Time, where you also talked about the book. And then another shout out, my pediatric colleagues actually shared your article from The Nation, your recent article, As a Black Mother, My Parenting is Always Political, which I also had an opportunity to read.
That's wonderful. That's great.
So for me, before even reading the book or even reading the article, the idea or the concept of parenting or Black parenting being political was just so compelling to me, right? Well, I didn't even think of parenting as political. And I was just wondering, how did you come to this understanding of parenting, especially being a Black mother?
Mm-hmm. Well, when I was pregnant with my daughter, I was in my third trimester during the summer of 2016. She's 2.5 now. And I remember so clearly that summer, it was July, and Alton Sterling was killed by police in Baton Rouge. And it was either the next day or the day after that, Philando Castile was killed by police in the Twin Cities while his partner and her 4-year-old daughter sat just inches away from him in their car. And I remember really being at this moment. Another thing that happened that same month was there was a lot of activity around Black Lives Matter organizing and protest. And I believe some police officers in Dallas were shot at during a rally, and BLM was blamed. And that's when we began to see a lot of the rhetoric on cable news around Blue Lives Matter and even more importantly, framing BLM as like a terrorist organization and a threat to public safety. And I had been, in addition to covering reproductive health and reproductive justice in the previous years, I had also been covering BLM organizing, and the movement that they were describing was not the movement that I had come to know through my reporting. And so all of these things came together that summer in a way that really made me afraid, and have an emotional response that was unfamiliar to me as a journalist. So I was used to, taking in a lot of difficult information, being exposed to troubling news events and having to make sense of them. But I think because of my training, I was always able to hold those things at arm's length and, kind of hold them at a distance, not take them personally. But when I was pregnant, I was really wrapped up in a lot of fear around, like, oh my goodness, what does this mean for this child that I'm about to have? And what does this mean for my family? And I just felt fear in a visceral way that I hadn't really experienced before. So I think that's, a touch of what I mean about the politics of Black parenting. I think all parents experience a heightened level of fear and anxiety when we become parents, because we're responsible for shepherding this young life through a world. But I think for Black parents, that fear and anxiety takes on a different kind of urgency and intensity because of the political and social context in which we live. And so that's a bit of what I mean. I also just want to briefly mention, we're at a moment where the Black maternal health crisis is being covered in a way that it hasn't been before. There's a lot of attention being paid, with good reason, to the fact that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely than white women to die from complications related to childbirth. And I think even a statistic like that gets into the politics of Black mothering, because once you're aware of a stat like that, the next question is, why are we dying? And what can be done about it? And when you start to get into that question, then you start to look more closely at implicit bias and medical racism and these issues that have to do with white supremacy within our institutions. And so I think there are many, many different ways in which Black motherhood is political.
And I think, you brought up some in my world, so I'm a pediatrician, but I also work in public health, that one thing I loved is how you interwove public health and health topics, like you mentioned, implicit bias, reproductive health justice, poverty, social justice issues. And, you spoke to the growing Black maternal health disparities and health crisis. What spoke to you about the importance of sort of creating that intersection for the book regarding those public health topics and Black mothering? Was it solely those statistics, or was there something else, your background reporting that kind of like put it all, just made it clear to you that there is this intersectionality?
Right. I really appreciate that question. So since the end of 2012, I've been covering reproductive health. I got a journalism fellowship at the end of 2012, and my beat at that time became reproductive rights. It was kind of broadly conceived as like reproductive rights and reproductive health. And so I started thinking about how I wanted to construct the beat, and I noticed that a lot of reporters who focus on these issues focus primarily on abortion and contraception. And these are incredibly important issues. And I knew that I had to and wanted to cover the politics around abortion and birth control. But I also started coming into contact with Black-led organizations that were talking about something different. And the framework that they introduced me to was something called reproductive justice. And what was explained to me was that reproductive justice is a human rights framework that asserts our right to have a child, to not have a child, and to parent the children that we do have in safe and healthy communities. And I thought that was just so, all of a sudden things just clicked for me, because I felt like Black women and women of color more broadly were often left out of the coverage of reproductive rights as it had traditionally been done. And when I was introduced to this reproductive justice framework, I realized, like, okay, this allows us, when you talk about the right to not have a child, okay, then we're talking about abortion and contraception. But the right to have a child and to parent those children in safe and healthy communities, then we start to get into a broader conversation about families. And not only about families, but about, our neighborhoods. Are our neighborhoods safe? Gun violence, police violence and state violence, segregated schools, right? Then we start to get into this larger question about what it's like to be a parent, not just to choose to not be a parent. And then I felt like that's when I started seeing a lot of the interesting conversation around that really centered Black women and women of color. And it made sense because I learned that the reproductive justice framework was created and articulated by Black women 25 years ago. And so I think, I'm a Black woman who has had a range of different reproductive experiences myself. But I think it was really being introduced to the reproductive justice framework and then having that guide my reporting over the past 6-7 years that really laid the foundation for this book.
I just want to go back to, I think, really, really poignant quote, parenting in safe and healthy communities. And to me, that sort of contextualizes, I think, the one theme that continued to resonate throughout the book is, and how do we define family? And I think the book does, pays a great homage to Black mothers and families, but puts it in a sort of kind of flips the perspective of what we consider or how we define family. And it kind of like, all right, so I'm an African American woman and I'm first generation. So in some ways I felt like I should have known this, right? Known some of the history, but it was still sort of startling because, again, raised to be like, okay, you want to look like the Cosbys, right? And be like the
Right.
Cosbys. But really broadening that definition of what family, the inclusiveness of family. My husband, I think, really fits in the definition of how you define family, that sort of intergenerational, like the whole village approach.
Yeah.
And I think I had that, but a little, kind of in bits and pieces, because most of my family, they lived either in New York, we lived in DC, and my husband's family, they were very much, cousins and uncles. They all lived they didn't live together, but they lived close enough together.
Right.
So I was just wondering how that advocacy. I think of the book as advocacy as well, to sort of dispel myths of negative stigma and definitions of what the Black family is. And I was just wondering how did you feel about writing that in the book? I know you've lived it, but I'm just wondering, how did you feel about? Did you think that you were going to be an advocate for Black families, or kind of redefining the definition of Black families?
That's fascinating. I love thinking about it in the context of advocacy, because I usually really am like, I am not an advocate, I'm a journalist. But when you frame it that way and talk about the advocacy of dispelling myths as a form of advocacy, I can embrace that. Yes, I knew that I couldn't tell a story about Black mothering without pushing back against stigma surrounding so-called single parent families, unmarried women heading households. I knew that based on my own experience and the research, that I had to confront those myths head on and talk about the inclusive way that we do family, if I was going to talk about Black mothering at all. So, what I say in the book, I talk in the book about the fact that I was raised by my mom, who, she's 65 now, she's never married. I wasn't raised with my father around. I met him when I was in my mid-20s. My mother has 7 sisters, and so my aunts and uncles and first cousins were a big part of my life, but also because of where we lived in southwestern Ohio, just outside of Cincinnati, I grew up in the house that my grandfather's grandparents built, and they had settled in a community with their relatives. So I grew up with my cousins, people I call my cousins, they're really the grandchildren of my grandfather's first cousin. So again, I just have this very expansive understanding of what family is. This idea of the nuclear family has never been that relevant in my life. When I think about who loves me and who cares about me and who I love and care for. So, and I know that I'm not alone in that. I mean, that's very common when I talk to Black people. And I appreciate your point that, you mentioned your husband, but you said that this is also something that you could relate to, because I think even when we do marry, we still are very connected to grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and all of that. And so it felt very important. And then, so I talk a little bit in the book about my own experience. I'm also not married to my daughter's father, but he plays a big role in her life, and he and I have a positive relationship. And she spends a lot of time with her paternal grandparents. And I feel really proud of us, for forging a way, making a way forward, and just prioritizing our daughter, even though our romantic relationship didn't work out. And I think we are able to do that in part because Black people have this legacy of creating families that work, even if we don't match the kind of mainstream, typically white presentation of what family is supposed to look like, or the Cosby version, as you put it. And I also think that, it's interesting to talk about Cosby within this context. I mentioned Cosby because I remember as a kid being called a Cosby kid, but that had to do with the fact that I was middle class and I had this kind of educational privilege and class privilege. And I think what happens too often is that the kind of, pundits and the marriage promoters talk about marriage as a way to lift people out of poverty. And they kind of, equate unmarried parents, so-called single mothers, with poverty. And that is just not true. And so I think often these things correlate, but to say that if you are an unmarried parent, you will be poor, that is not, that's not the case. It's a, correlation rather than causation. And so I spend a lot of time in that in the third chapter of the book, talking about trying to unpack some of these myths around poverty and marriage, and also get into the history of it. If we lived through centuries of slavery where our family bonds didn't mean anything. You could be in love with someone and form a romantic bond with someone, but they could be sold away from you. The same thing with your children. We didn't have any control. We didn't have the legal right to be parents, to be family, until, post-emancipation. And I think you can't have this conversation without mentioning the history around it. And so I really try to do that as well.
And I think you have like some brilliant points in terms of, again, sort of flipping data. Like you talk about, the data of black single family headed households, and that 40%, people tend to stress that 40% of families that are, fit in that category tend to live in poverty, but then we ignore that 60% of families are thriving.
Exactly.
Right. And I think you do a great job of, again, I think uplifting women in the sense that, and even our community or communities in general, is that there are root causes for many of it's the poverty, right? It's not necessarily race. And I as a provider, as a scientist, right, and as a woman of color, I do get frustrated when I see race constantly being used as a proxy.
Yeah.
When you know that there are other reasons, and unfortunately, you have to ask yourself, why are there communities of color? Why are certain socioeconomic classes disenfranchised, right? And it's not just because of race. There are other, and I think you do a great job of, again, this intersectionality, this sort of reckoning of, when there's this kind of cocktail, this is what happens. But when you have this other cocktail, there's families can thrive and flourish.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And you mentioned kind of the different methods that I use in the book. And so I am looking at data. I'm talking about my own experiences, but I also talk to dozens of Black mothers and grandmothers to draw from their experiences as well. And so I just want to, there's in that chapter, in the family chapter, that I interview a woman named Zara Alabanza, who lives in Atlanta with her two sons, who are her adopted sons. They're actually her biological nephews. They're her brother's children, who she adopted when they were, I think, 1 and 4, and now they're like preteens. And she talks about, how they're forming family. She's an unmarried, I believe, unpartnered person who also describes herself as polyamorous, meaning she's not looking for a monogamous relationship. And she talks about just kind of how her friends and, her network of close friends in her community, some of which is in Atlanta, some of which is in, Chicago or New York, how they really come together to make sure that these young people, her sons, are getting what they need. And so it was really important for me to just talk to Black women about how they're living and how they're forming family in ways that work for them.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about, some of the chapters, like, for example, you have you have different, the titles of the chapters, birth, family. So it's sort of almost broken up based on stages of, childhood and parenting. Right. And I was wondering, how did you come to, or how did that inform the development of the chapters, or what informed you wanting to take that approach in laying out the book?
So my daughter's 2.5, and when I started writing the book, I really started writing the book that summer when I was pregnant, because I ended up writing a cover story for The Nation that tied my own experience with pregnancy and birth to my reporting on the Black maternal health crisis. So I would say kind of technically I started writing the book when I was pregnant, but as I started thinking about, okay, this is going to be a book project beyond just this research I've done on pregnancy and birth, I realized I started thinking about it in terms of all the questions that I had about parenting and about how to do right by my child. And some of the questions were of immediate importance, like, are we going to spank her? Or how are we going to deal with discipline? Or, okay, what kind of books, board books and picture books are we going to have around the house? Or I want to get her in like these toddler programs, these mommy and me programs. How do I choose these early childhood development environments for her? But then some of them were on my mind already, but not pressing quite yet. So questions like, how do you talk to young people about sex? I was at one point I was working on the book, and it was when all the Me Too revelations and accusations were coming out. And I was thinking about issues of consent and sexual safety and bodily autonomy, and thinking like, how am I going to talk to my child about this? And so it just came to me that a good way to structure it would be kind of chronologically, exactly what you said. The book is structured in the way that you would think about how a child develops. So from pregnancy and birth through the kind of toddler and preschool years, through the teenage, through schooling, because there's a chapter on schools and how to navigate these segregated schools, to a chapter on the body, which does deal with, bodily autonomy and sex and consent and pleasure, a chapter on spiritual development, how do you give your child a moral compass and initiate them into spiritual community. And then the final chapter is the most explicitly political chapter, and it's about really how do parents have explicit conversations with their children about their political values. So the sex, spirit, politics, those are questions that might be more front of mind when you have a teenager, rather than, a young child. And so I thought that just structuring the book along, mirroring kind of the stages of development of a child would be the kind of easiest and clearest way to do it.
Yes, clear to me, being a pediatrician. Good. I loved it. I mean, I can't tell you how much I enjoy reading this book.
Oh, good.
Because initially I'm thinking, all right, so political power, Black motherhood. Reading the title, I thought I had my preconceived notions about the book, but then as I read it, you write so well. I'm like, I'm taking notes. And again, I love the back and forth that you have in your conversations with other women, other Black women, and sharing their experiences. And then sort of in some ways you reflect on that. And then you go back into how your mothering and your experiences, your lived experiences.
Mm-hmm. So thank you. So that means a lot. Thank you for saying that. And I also wanted to complicate this notion of what do we mean when we talk about politics?
Sure.
Because, talking about, that's what I was trying to do in the book. So often when people hear politics, they're thinking like electoral politics, like voting, or what do I think about the Trump administration, or, and I think, okay, that's an aspect of what we mean when we talk about politics. But there's also something political about taking your child to preschool and being the only Black family there and observing the power dynamics that are playing out in the room with these toddlers when your child's the only Black toddler or only toddler of color. Like that's a political question. What do we do? How do we guide our child in situations like that? What kind of conversations do we have to have with our children's teachers? And in the doctor's office, when we have to advocate for our children, that's political. And so that was something I wanted to do that with the book. I wanted to expand our notions of what we mean when we talk about politics.
And I think the one thing for me that was really heartening in reading the book is that I felt like I was validated in the sense that, I've been a mom now for 21 years. So, actually almost 21. My oldest will be 21 later this year. And I'm just recounting, like, this morning, right? I'm waking up at 3:00 in the morning, because we're doing college tours now for my youngest son. And I'm thinking, I want him to do well in his physics class, get his GPA up, right? Because you want this bright future for him, not only because he's he's my son, but because he's a black male, right? And so all these worries in my mind, and I'm thinking, I gotta get back to my mindfulness, right? I can't control what I can't control,
right?
But there is that validation that, yeah, we have these thoughts. I think, and sometimes I kind of feel like, well, are they justified? Is it paranoia? But I think, and that I have to answer for myself. But I did feel validated, right? Because even when they were little and going to school, right, my guard was up when I got a call from the teacher's office, right? Oh, your son's not doing well in class, and it's like, okay, and I don't know if I had at that time the voice to tell someone else. Like I may have told my husband, we have conversations, but in some ways you kind of feel there's sort of like a shame or guilt because, like, am I putting up the race card too fast?
Right.
So, but I love the validation that, what, it could be what it is, or, unfortunately the way this society is, there's this anxiety, this angst that some Black parents have.
I really appreciate you saying that. So I've been touring the book for the past 2 weeks. It came out April 2nd. And the events have just been incredible. Just Black people coming out, and non-Black people too. But I have to say, I feel especially affirmed by Black women coming who have had a chance to read the book, who say, kind of matter-of-factly, like, oh, you basically just took everything we've always been doing and put it in a book. And I think some people might hear that as like, well, what did you really do? You just like did what we, like, what's new here? But I feel really affirmed by that because too often we're invisible. And so if there's a way that I could be helpful by naming our practices that we engage in at home and in our communities, I'm very, then I feel like I've done my job. And I also appreciate you pointing out, the kind of like how sometimes we can think, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious or afraid. Am I just paranoid, or like, is it with good reason? And I think one of the values of the book, or one of the kind of, at least something that was positive for me in doing the book, was talking to people who share those same anxieties and fears, but then also hearing from them their different strategies and the different ways that they deal with their fear and anxiety. So I think one example of that would be, in my second chapter, I talk a lot about discipline. And I know you've talked a lot about discipline on your podcast from, different perspectives. And I think it's really useful to have, I have some voices in there that are saying, spanking is violence. We don't engage in that. It's a legacy from slavery, and I want my children to be able to question authority, and nobody has the right to put their hands on them. And then I have another mother who says, the stakes are too high. I can't have my daughter out here acting any kind of way. She needs to know what is expected of her and what's going to be okay, because someone else is going to punish her and discipline her much more harshly than I'm going to, even if I do put my hands on her. So I think that's important, is to acknowledge that our fears are real and justified, and there are a range of responses that we can have to those fears. And I think that the people I interviewed offer us a whole bunch of different strategies that we can draw from.
And I think those strategies, provide, a roadmap to resiliency. And so that sort of brings me to, to one of my, I think the biggest questions I had for you was, as I was reading the book and the way it ended, I was wondering, did you also feel like this was a call to action? Like, I felt like there was a call to action in the book, even if it's not the parents, but even for parents, but also society in general, governments in general. So even some of that play on the political. So I just wanted to get your thoughts about that.
I do think that there is a call to action there. And I think really the call to action is around community building. I write a lot in the book about, so my daughter and I live in Cincinnati. We live here, my mom is here. This is where I'm from. This is where her dad is from. So his family is here too. And we have a lot of support from family and extended family. However, I've lived most of my adult life elsewhere, in New York City, in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. And I talk in the book about how sometimes I feel pulled back to these more progressive coastal areas where it feels like there are more options in terms of the type of schools and after school programs and community-based organizations that I think could be really good for my daughter and good for our family. But then I think there's kind of an interesting pivot in the book where instead of looking to the coasts for that kind of community or models of community, I turn my attention to Detroit, where I've spent some time, and I talk a lot about something called Detroit Summer, which is a youth development program that was started, I believe, in the early 90s by James Boggs and Grace Lee Boggs and some other longtime Detroiters who really brought a kind of revolutionary and evolutionary spirit to the city, to thinking about the city at a time when there was, massive deindustrialization, white flight, disinvestment in the city. So you had, this previously thriving metropolis where Black people had gone en masse during the Great Migration for jobs in the auto factories, and then suddenly it becomes something else, this kind of shell of its former self. And then you have these people who are really intent on helping young people, native Detroiters, develop a love for where they're from. And they do this by creating this program called Detroit Summer, which engaged young people in community development projects like community gardening, public art projects, interviewing their elders to learn about the history of the city, so developing like media skills and interviewing skills. And so I lift up Detroit as an example of the kind of organizing that I'm really interested in engaging my daughter in. And so that's just one example of kind of what I'm curious about personally, is how do I become a part of a project like that? And how do and I really want it to be a kind of intergenerational, multi-age project that my daughter could be involved in, that my mom could be involved in. I interview a woman here named Kemia Moyo, who started a project here in Cincinnati called Sankofa. That was a youth development project for young Black teenagers that I also think is an important model. So I am trying to lift up these models of families turning to one another and saying, we don't have exactly what we need. How can we create it together? And how can we strengthen our relationships, that are rooted in trust, and really get to know each other and care about each other and trust each other, and then create the kind of institutions that we need. So I think that is the call to action, the kind of, I think it's subtle, but I think you picked up on something that is there. I'm curious about engaging in a broad conversation with other people who want to start to create these types of institutions.
So knowing what you know now and having a 2.5-year-old and writing the book, how has your idea of being a mom, being a Black mom, either changed or maybe it hasn't changed?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think I also feel affirmed. I felt kind of isolated in my anxiety. And it really helped to talk to people from all over the country, 75-year-olds, to people in their 20s, Midwesterners to, Californians, and see that we are all just thinking about the same things, and that this just is the condition of Black mothering. And I think just having these conversations helped me feel certainly less alone, but also more confident. Like, I can do this because we've always done it. We've always figured out a way in conditions much more dire than the ones that I'm living in. And so I feel more confident. I feel a little bit more relaxed, and I feel like it has it's been good for my perfectionism, because it's like, you're not going to get it perfect, and that's fine. Children don't need perfection. They just need love and care and your best efforts. And so I think that's been the biggest takeaway for me.
I think that's great, because I think, someone like myself, it took me a little bit longer to kind of put that together. And I think you've had a great opportunity to kind of get to that sort of realization at the time that was best for you, I hope other moms, other dads, when they read the book, they'll also be affirmed. And I think they will be. I think you've done, again, a wonderful job in shedding light on what family is, and our triumphs, our strengths, our resilience, the tough times, but also I think we, as the title says, we live for the we. And it is a community, and I think that speaks to your call to action for community engagement. If you feel differently, you can speak to that.
No, that's exactly right. I'm glad you mentioned the title. So the title comes from a conversation that I had with someone named Kat Brooks. She's a mother and an organizer living in Oakland. She does a lot of work supporting families that have lost a loved one to state violence. And she actually ran for mayor of Oakland, and she was in the middle of her campaign when I interviewed her last summer. And we were talking, we were in her office, and we were talking, and at the time her daughter was 12, and she was telling me that sometimes her daughter will say, can we just have dinner together, quiet dinner together, or I don't want to go to this or that, meeting or rally, and just kind of push back against the reality of their lives, which is they're in the community a lot doing community work. Someone just got killed by police. We need to rally around them. We need to support the family. And Kat Brooks said, I tell my daughter all the time, but it's harsh. But we don't live for the I, we live for the we. And when she said that, it just was such a perfect articulation of what I had heard from other mothers that I interviewed, and also what I'd read in the Black motherhood literature from people like Patricia Hill Collins, who have written about community mothering, other mothering, mother work, and the fact that for Black mothers, it's not usually the case that when we see a problem, if our child is having a problem, we don't try to fix it just for the benefit of our child and our family. We see, okay, well, if my child is experiencing this in school, other Black kids are experiencing this in school, other children are experiencing this in school. If we don't have a playground on the block, that's not just bad for my child, that's bad for all the kids on this block. And so there's a kind of community orientation, I think, to Black mothering that really came through both in my review of existing literature and certainly through my interviews. And so I just, am forever indebted to Kat Brooks for her words, because I think it's really the perfect title for what I'm trying to communicate with this book.
So Dani, before we wrap up, if our listeners wanted to learn more about your work and your journalism work and your writing in the book, where is the best way to reach out to you?
Sure. I would say, so my website is DaniMcClain.com. And I am on Twitter at Dr. McClain, and that I am not a doctor. Those are my initials. So Dr. McClain. I'm on Instagram. And yeah, I think I just so appreciate these conversations. And so for those that have read the book or want to read the book or learn more about my journalism, those are all good ways to reach me. And I would love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Dani.
I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to What is Black podcast. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. And if you have Apple Podcasts, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review us. And tell a friend. Until next time.